The summer everyone else cleared rocks from their fields, one poor boy spent every afternoon carrying them back. Neighbors would stop their trucks along the dirt road just to watch him do it. A thin boy of maybe 14, hauling stones in a rusted wheelbarrow, stacking them
This
in
earth is
careful
strong,
rows
it
across
teaches us to
ground that
endure.
had nothing
How does
left
it
to
teach?
give.
It
They
holds
shook
firm
their
even in the
heads.
wind.
They
I want to be
laughed.
strong too.
Some
You
even
will
offered
be.
to help him fix
You can't
what
just
they
ignore this.
assumed
We have
was
to
a
act now.
mistake.
You're wrong.
He never
Rushing in will
answered
get us
them.
all killed.
He just
And waiting
kept
will destroy
walking,
us.
one
Look at the
stone at
sky.
a
The
time,
storm's here. We can't
toward
win.
a field that would go
Whoa,
on
look
to
at all
produce
these
a harvest
worms.
nobody in
They're
that
everywhere
town would
under
ever
this rock.
forget. Why was he
Ooh,
doing
it tickles.
this? Why
I
did the
gotta
whole
show
town
Mom.
find it so funny? And what, exactly, did he think he was building? Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a pile of rocks the same way again. Welcome back to Fireside Files. Nobody knew, not yet, not even his own father. The town was called Millbrook Hollow, a place so small it didn't appear on most maps, tucked between dry hills and a river that ran thinner every year. The soil there had once been rich, dark and soft, the kind farmers bragged about at the feed store. But the droughts had come one after another, and the ground had hardened into something closer to clay brick than earth. Cracks split the fields like old scars. The wind carried dust instead of the smell of green things. The boy's name was Eli. His family's farm sat at the edge of town, 4 acres that had belonged to his grandfather, and his grandfather before him. His father, Thomas, worked from before sunrise until the light gave out, but no amount of work seemed to matter anymore. The corn came up thin and yellow. The beans withered before they climbed the poles. Some nights, Eli heard his parents talking quietly in the kitchen about numbers that didn't add up, about a bank that kept sending letters, about maybe having to sell. His mother, Ruth, kept a small garden near the porch, tomatoes, a few herbs, whatever she could coax out of the ground. She never complained. She hummed while she worked, even when the tomatoes came in small and cracked. Eli used to watch her from the porch steps, wondering how she stayed hopeful when everything around them seemed to be dying slowly in the heat. It was his grandmother, Nana Vera, who noticed things nobody else did. She was old enough to remember a different Millbrook Hollow, one with taller corn, cooler summers, streams that didn't dry up by July. She spent her mornings sitting on an overturned crate near the fence line, watching the land the way other people watched television. She didn't say much, but when she did speak, people tended to listen, even if they pretended not to. One evening, as the sun dropped low and orange over the hills, Eli found her out by the driest corner of the field, running her fingers through the cracked soil. "You feel that?" she asked, not looking up. Ground screaming. Eli crouched beside her. The dirt was hot, even though the sun had nearly set. It crumbled like ash between his fingers. "It's not holding anything," Nana Vera said. "Not water, not cool. It just bakes all day and forgets everything by morning." Eli didn't fully understand what she meant. Not yet. But something about the way she said it stayed with him, turning over in his mind for days. He started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. The old stone wall bordering the Hendersons' property, tumbled down and half buried. The grass beneath it, he realized, was always a little greener, even in the worst heat. The flat rocks along the dry creek bed, and how the soil hiding underneath them stayed cool and damp long after the sun had scorched everything around it. He started lifting stones just to look. Every single time, the ground beneath was darker, moister, alive with tiny insects that had no business surviving a Millbrook Hollow summer. He didn't have a word for what he was seeing. He only knew it meant something. He mentioned it to his father one night at dinner, hesitant, half expecting to be waved off. Thomas listened, tired, then shrugged. "Rocks don't grow beans, Eli." It wasn't unkind. It was just exhaustion talking. Thomas had no energy left for theories. He needed a harvest, not an experiment. But Nana Vera, who missed nothing, caught Eli's eye across the table and gave the smallest nod. That was enough. The next morning, before the heat set in, Eli began collecting stones. He carried them from the dry creek bed, from the collapsed wall at the property line, from a pile the Hendersons had cleared off their own land years ago and left to rot in the weeds. He laid them across a small section of the worst part of the field, no more than a strip 10 feet wide, packing them close together around the base of a few struggling bean plants, the way he'd seen the moisture collect beneath the flat creek stones. He didn't tell anyone what he was hoping for. He barely understood it himself. He only knew, in the quiet, patient way that ran through him like a second heartbeat, that the land was trying to tell them something, and that stones, heavy, useless, laughed at stones, might be the answer nobody else was willing to consider. Word spread fast in a town that small. A poor boy hauling rocks onto his family's dying field, instead of hauling them off it, was too strange not to talk about. Men at the feed store joked that the Barnett boy had finally lost his mind from the heat. Someone suggested he was building a fort. Someone else laughed that maybe he thought he'd grow a rock garden instead of a bean garden, since beans clearly weren't working out for that family anyway. Eli heard the laughter. It stung more than he let on. But every afternoon after his chores, he went back out to that same 10-foot strip and kept working. The first failure came within 2 weeks. He'd stacked the stones too high, too tightly packed, without gaps for air or rain to reach the soil beneath. When a rare thunderstorm rolled through, the water ran straight off the mound instead of soaking in. The plants beneath, drowned in runoff on one side and stayed bone dry on the other. 2 of his bean plants died within days. He almost stopped there. Almost let the joke win. But what happened next changed everything, and you're not going to believe how close he came to quitting for good. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't your average farm story. Hit that subscribe button before we go on, because Fireside Files brings you stories like this every single week. Nana Vera found him sitting by the ruined strip, staring at it in the fading light. "You didn't fail," she said, easing herself down onto the ground beside him, slower than she used to. "You just found out one way that doesn't work. That's not nothing, boy. That's information." She didn't offer him a solution. She never did. She just sat with him a while, and then went inside, leaving him alone with the problem, and somehow, a little more resolved than before. He tried again. Flatter stones this time, spaced with small gaps, layered instead of piled. It held moisture better. But the second failure came from a direction he hadn't expected. Without any shade, the exposed soil between the stones baked so hard in the afternoon sun that it cracked worse than before, undoing whatever moisture the stones had managed to trap overnight. Weeks of work, and the strip looked barely different from the dead ground around it. By the third setback, something inside him wavered. A sudden hailstorm scattered half his careful arrangement, and a section of dark, promising soil he'd been proud of dried out and crumbled to dust within days, after he lost the will to rebuild it right away. He stopped going out to the field for nearly a week. He told himself it had been a foolish idea from the start, that the whole town had been right to laugh. It was his mother, of all people, who brought him back. She didn't lecture him. She simply set a cup of cool water beside him on the porch one evening and said, "Your grandmother tells me that corner of dirt looks better than it has in 3 years, even half-finished." She let that sit for a moment. Seems like a strange thing to give up on. Eli went back out the next morning. This time, he adjusted the spacing again, angled the larger stones to cast a little shade across the gaps at midday, and left small channels for rain to funnel down toward the roots instead of running off. It was slow, careful work, the work of someone who had finally stopped guessing and started paying real attention. The first payoff was small enough that only Eli noticed it. One bean plant, in the very center of the stone strip, stood a shade greener than anything else on the farm. A week later, there were 3. Then his father noticed, pausing mid-stride on his way to the barn, staring at that strip of ground longer than he meant to. Then earthworms appeared in soil that hadn't held a single worm in 3 summers. Then birds started landing near the stones in the early morning, pecking at insects that had returned to soil cool and damp enough to sustain them. Old Mr. Henderson, who'd farmed longer than anyone in Millbrook Hollow, came by one evening under the excuse of borrowing a tool he didn't need. He crouched at the edge of the strip for a long time, running the dark soil through his weathered fingers the way Nana Vera once had. "Stone mulching," he muttered, almost to himself. "Read about this years back. Never seen anybody actually try it." He explained it plainly, the way old farmers do. How the stones soaked up heat during the day and released it slowly at night, keeping the soil from swinging between scorched and frozen. How they blocked the sun from baking the ground directly, letting whatever moisture existed actually stay put instead of evaporating by noon. How the gaps between properly placed stones channeled rain downward instead of letting it run off wasted. It wasn't magic, it was simple physics dressed up in patience, something farmers in dry climates around the world had used for centuries, long since forgotten by a town that had gotten used to easier seasons. Word of Mr. Henderson's visit spread faster than the joke ever had. By midsummer, a county agricultural extension officer drove out to see it for himself, kneeling in the dirt in his pressed shirt, taking soil samples, asking Eli question after question that the boy answered simply, honestly, without a trace of pride. The officer left shaking his head, not in mockery this time, but in something closer to disbelief. A local reporter came next, notebook in hand, snapping photographs of a 14-year-old boy standing in a strip of the greenest, healthiest beans anyone in Millbrook Hollow had seen in years. A strip surrounded on all sides by cracked, defeated dirt. That was the turning point for Thomas. A father who had spent the summer too exhausted to believe in rocks finally knelt down in his son's strip of soil, felt the coolness of it beneath the surface, and made a decision. Together, father and son spent the following weeks hauling stones from the creek bed, the old property line, the ditches nobody else wanted, widening the strip a little more every evening after the regular chores were done. What had started as 10 feet of stubborn hope slowly grew into rows, then into a quarter of the field, then more. Each new section built with everything Eli had learned from his failures. And then came the moment nobody expected. The same men who had laughed outside the feed store, who had joked about rock gardens and lost mines, showed up at the fence line one by one, hats in hand, asking Eli the same quiet question. "Can you show us how you did it?" There was no gloating in Eli's answer. No mention of the jokes, the whispers, the weeks he'd nearly given up. He simply walked them along the rows, showing them where to place the flat stones, how to angle them, how far apart to leave the gaps. Patient, the same way he'd always been, teaching the very people who once laughed at him without a hint of resentment in his voice. By harvest, the transformation covered nearly half the Barnett farm. Every stretch of it built one careful section at a time, the same patient way it had all begun. The beans hung heavy and full, deep green leaves shading soil that stayed dark and moist even in the punishing afternoon heat. The corn stood taller than it had in years, the husks tight, the kernels plump with a season's worth of stored moisture. Golden late summer light spilled across the field in long warm bands, catching on dew that had no business existing in a place that had forgotten what dew felt like. Neighbors walked the rows in near silence, running their hands over stalks and leaves as if they needed to touch it to believe it. Nana Vera stood at the fence line, watching it all with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen the ground scream and had finally watched it answer with a harvest instead. Thomas stood beside his son in the field that evening, saying nothing for a long while. Then he rested a hand on Eli's shoulder, the kind of gesture that meant more from a tired, worn-down father than any speech could have. What Eli had really planted that summer wasn't just beans and corn. It was proof that the answers people overlook are often lying right in front of them, dismissed as worthless simply because nobody bothered to look closer. He hadn't been the smartest person in Millbrook Hollow. He'd simply been the most patient, willing to fail 3 times, to be laughed at, to keep watching the land long after everyone else had stopped paying attention to it. Sometimes the things the world calls useless are only waiting for someone humble enough to see them differently. What lessons stayed with you the most from Eli's story? And where in the world are you watching this from? I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments below. And if this story moved you, you know what to do. Subscribe to Fireside Files, because there's a lot more where this came from.